expectations for continuous auditing. So, leave you with John.
Thank you, Robert. It's good to hear that some forms of humor transcend all the language barriers. Let me just get this going here. So the audit analytic capability model, I'll just give you a little bit of background by what we at ACL, we try and keep fairly close touch with our own customer base and the internal audit market, the audit market overall, just to get some sense of how things are progressing, particularly in regard to continuous auditing and monitoring. And in general, we see the ongoing trend, the ongoing progress that's being made, increased understanding, increased awareness of what continuous auditing and monitoring is, what the benefits are, why it should be considered. Within the profession, in the last year, there's the Institute of Internal Auditors. We helped produce the Global Technology Audit Guide number 3 on continuous auditing some years ago. That's now being reworked. We're working again with the IIA on a rework of the GTAG. And some other things that have been progressing, we see in the broader market, outside audit of continuous control monitoring, that there's progress there, driven by a number of factors and supported by software vendors, a number of whom are represented here, who specialize in CCM. And we even see Gartner, the big analyst firm, who've been bringing out magic quadrants, that their overall assessment of technologies within a given area. They've been producing them on GRC for some time, and this year they produced their first magic quadrant specifically on continuous controls monitoring, which I think is a good indication that it's beginning to be taken seriously as a market. I speak on continuous auditing and monitoring quite frequently, generally to auditors. I probably speak at a dozen or so conferences a year, have done on continuous auditing and monitoring 6 or 7 years, probably speak to 2,000 or 3,000 auditors every year. And during the last year, what I typically do, if there's an audience of a few hundred people, is I get a show of hands to say, so who's using audit analytics within their internal audit practice? And now I would say it's usually 80%. 80% of people say, yeah, within our internal audit departments, we're actually using audit analytics. Then I say, so who's interested, who's intending to use continuous auditing and monitoring to implement one or the other or both? And I would say it's usually well over 50% say, yep, that's what we want to do. Then the next question is a show of hands. So how many are actually doing it? How many are actually, within their audit department, have they implemented or using continuous auditing? And normally at that point, it's around 10, 15%. And if you ask a question, what are you doing? In some cases, some of those people are maybe running some audit analytic tests every 3 months on a given area, which is maybe continuous auditing, but not quite the sort of thing I think that we're talking about typically in this forum. How many of you, or how many of you are in organizations where continuous monitoring is taking place of financial business process areas? And you're probably looking, typically the show of hands is down around 5 or 10%. So that's still progress. A few years ago, quite often there'll be nobody who's actually doing continuous monitoring. So one of the issues that we face, on the one hand, there's organizations like the ones represented here, Rod at Siemens, there's Jason with Siemens, there's Mark from Becton Dickinson, there's Banking Tau, for example, are doing great things with continuous auditing and monitoring with varying degrees of success. But the reality is that there's still an awful lot of organizations that we see who want to do continuous monitoring, they want to do continuous auditing, maybe they bought some technology, but they're nowhere close to really achieving the benefits and the outcomes that they would like to get. So we spend a lot of time working with our own customers, thinking about it, and we've put together this audit analytic capability model really to identify what we see as the various stages that you typically need to go through in this journey towards continuous auditing. I mean, you can take if you like, the Big Bang approach and say, yeah, we're going to do continuous auditing and monitoring. and we've got a target date by which we're going to be up and running. But the reality is that in most cases, there's a whole series of building blocks that need to be in place in order to really be successful in continuous auditing and monitoring. And one of the things that we see is, in the end, the issues are rarely ones of technology, and they're increasingly issues of what we hear so much about, but it really is the case, of people and process, around audit processes, around impacts on business processes, and so on. So in this journey of audit analytics, as you move towards continuous auditing, or you extend your use of continuous auditing and monitoring, what we put together is this capability model really as a means of doing a couple of things. One is for organizations to try and understand, we'll get clarity around what are those typical building blocks, what are the typical stages you have to go through, what are the people and process issues you need to address, and also to act as an assessment tool to determine where you are right now. And I guess one other benefit that we've seen from this approach is to be able to communicate sometimes outside internal audit what the benefits are of the various stages of use of audit analytics and the things that need to be in place to be successful. So that's why I thought it would be, we don't have a lot of time, but I'll just take you through some of the major stages of the analytic capability model. I don't think you're going to see anything startling in its innovation, really, but we're trying to just formulate some of the things that are very practical. I was talking with Joe Orengold for Visual Risk IQ. I've spoken with a number of the Big Four, and I think all of these organizations, in one way or another, are doing similar things. But I think it'd be useful to share it with this audience. We've identified 5 levels. We chose the words fairly carefully. I'll elaborate on those in a few minutes. Basic, through applied, through managed, through automated, to monitoring. And one thing that may be of interest on the y-axis on the left, an audit contribution. I don't know what, for those of you who are in internal audit, you may have heard Richard Chambers, CEO of the IIA. He's been talking quite a bit lately on the evolving role, the evolving expectations of internal audit, moving from the traditional hindsight view to providing more insight, and then providing more foresight for the organization in support of risk assessment, risk management processes. And what we generally see is some alignment in this capability model around the use of audit analytics. The historic view, the basic use of analytics, which really supports that hindsight view of what happened in the last year or so. Then moving increasingly to more comprehensive, extensive use of analytics integrated into the audit process really lets you get to this level of a different type of insight, a greater insight that as an auditor you can obtain in support of assurance and in support of the reporting that you can make to the business. And then when you get to that monitoring level, if you actually are monitoring transactions continuously across a number of different business process areas, you've got a dashboard that is showing the trends in exceptions that are being produced, and the way in which controls exceptions are being addressed, control issues being remediated. If you can look at visual dashboards of those trends, you're actually doing some of the things that I think Rod Brennan was talking to in the last session, is start to be able to get some early warning indicators and generate some foresight into evolving risk issues. So that's the model overall. Let me take you through quite quickly what we see as being the key components of each level. The basic one, I don't need to spend much time on it. It's really the basic use of analytics. Incidentally, it's the one where most people in the room, when I ask for a show of hands, at the end of the day, say they're at level 1, maybe going to level 2, the majority of people. So you typically are using audit analytics in support of the audit process, part of maybe of an initial assessment. You're running some statistics on a complete data population that supports the audit area you're looking at. You do some classification. You may do some look for the obvious things like duplicates, the low-hanging fruit, if you like. Maybe compare some data between a vendor master file and or vendor payment system and our employee system looking for matches between names and addresses and so on. So fairly basic use of analytics, and I think we're all aware that the basic value and intent of audit analytics. But then you get to that next level where there's a bit of a distinct change, because at this level, you're really integrating analytics into the internal audit process. So it's not just something that's left to a specialist to go off and do a bit of analysis. You're saying that analytics are a core, integral part of your audit process, and from the beginning of the process, as you sit down and you put together your audit plan or your audit program for a given area, you start off by identifying where audit analytics are going to be used, and you quite possibly you go for every different audit stage, every action item, step, whatever it is, and identify, in order to achieve that audit objective, can analytics help? And if so, does it make sense? Is it worth the time invested in developing an analytic for a given audit objective? But at the end of the day, what you're typically doing is producing a set of repeatable tests that support a range of audit objectives in an audit program. And we started to refer to this as an analytic-enabled audit program. So this is a fairly significant move ahead from that basic use of audit analytics. And it really takes some leadership from audit management, CAE, whoever it might be, to say, yeah, this is what we're going to do. It is an integral part of the audit process. We need to change the way we do our audits and use technology. So that's the next step. So at this level, we've got imagine what we've typically got. For a given audit area, we have a range of different audit analytics that have been identified that address specific audit and control objectives. At this point, we've had to deal with the huge issue of data access, but quite possibly at this point, an audit department has worked with IT. They've got access enabled to the appropriate data. Maybe the processes to download. Maybe they're using audit-specific software to get to that data independently. Very often, the data, the tests, the results may be distributed within an audit team. Various individuals, various audit teams as part of a national, maybe a global audit organization. So you've got all of this information decentralized. So the typical next stage is to say, okay, well, how do we manage this process? How do we centralize it? And at this point, you start to look at technology initially, a server-based technology, software that supports a centralized platform approach to analytics. So you've got all data in a central secure location. You've got those control tests in a central location, probably quality controlled. Somebody's checked them. You make sure you can't make changes to a particular test without a proper QA and approval process. You've got the results of tests structured in a way that makes sense. So you've got a well-managed, you've got a well-controlled environment, which is taking you to that next level of the whole audit analytic capability model. One of the things you're doing at this stage is not only if you can place greater reliance on the work that's being performed, the audit analytic procedures themselves, but you've really got to that point of increasingly able to make audit analytics a repeatable and a sustainable process. You know, one of the very practical issues of audit analytics is a time when a specialist does an awful lot of work with audit analytics, one or more specialists, that individual goes and you've lost a lot of that knowledge and that IP. It's through this approach, which is only partially technology, that you actually help to make audit analytics not just integral to the audit process, but something that's well managed, well controlled, and sustainable. And so you're dealing with security issues of data, for example. So often IT gets very nervous about the idea of internal audit having the entire GL, the entire P2P database or records on an audit machine. Well, at least if you're using a managed central environment, you're probably adhering to enterprise security standards. And so this really is just sort of a best practice. And then the next level, now this is where we call it automated, and we chose the word fairly carefully, but in many ways we're now talking about enabling continuous auditing. So we sort of got there. So at this point, you set up the procedures for regular access to data. You're refreshing a data repository with the appropriate data. It's being controlled. It's being tested to make sure it's a complete and accurate population. So it does support validly supports the type of tests that you want to be performing. And at this point, you're ready to start scheduling jobs, scheduling tests to be run on a recurring basis, to be run continuously, whatever we mean by continuously, which could be daily, it could be weekly, it could be monthly, depending on the natural business cycle. And you can make that choice of what test does it really make sense to run on a continuous basis, and what can be run on a as needed basis. So we've now started to move, at least we've got the technology components in place for continuous auditing. But the big challenge that typically we see organizations run into at this level is, how does this impact the audit process? If our traditional audit model is we build our audit plan for the year, we allocate resources out to these 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 different audits that we're going to perform over the coming year. But then what happens if you say, all right, no, we really want to be implementing continuous auditing in some of these core business process areas, maybe relatively low-risk areas, but we want to automate as much as we can. Well, how does that impact our resourcing model and our audit approach? Because suddenly you've got to start thinking about, well, who's actually, if we're running tests on 15 tests on the P2B cycle, a whole series of tests on journal entries on a regular basis. So who follows up? And how do they follow up? And what do they do with the results? How do they report on those results? So this is change in the audit process already. How do those activities then tie in with our more traditional cyclical audit approach and activities? So that's when things really start to change. And we're at the point where we've really got to deal with those people and process issues around continuous auditing. One of the reasons we didn't use the word continuous here but used automated was we think at this level you can make the choice of whether you really are performing continuous auditing, which might make sense in a lot of different areas, but where we've got all of the components in place, the data, the tests, the controlled environment, the managed environment, that we can really allow the non-technical auditor, or enable the non-technical auditor to start to use analytics more effectively. Because that's one of the big challenges I think we've seen over the years, is that the analytics have ended up being the domain of the specialist. The typical auditor struggles to use analytics effectively. But if you've got all these components in place, you can see that a broader population of auditors can either be running tests automatically, or from a library, or they can be responding to the results of tests that are being run on an automatic basis. So at this point, the outcome, hopefully, of what you're achieving is a form of multiple concurrent auditing, which is, as we've heard a number of people, I think, talk about in the past, is that enables audit to free up resources to focus on those areas of greater risk and leave the more routine, if you like, testing just to be performed on an automated basis. Then the next level, now this is where it gets interesting. If I knew which was up and down. The next level is interesting because logically, if you're assuming, as we find is the case, that audit is quite instrumental, internal audit, maybe external audit, instrumental in driving the business towards continuous monitoring, then what's typically happened at this point is audit is able to demonstrate the value to management, to the business, of continuous auditing techniques. So at this point, typically what happens is you say, well, wait a moment, I got my continuous auditing techniques in place. I'm identifying exceptions and results, and I'm following up with management through a reporting process. Well, why don't I just start routing results, these exceptions, directly to management? Now, of course, I think we all know that ideally in order to retain independence, you've got to move the whole process over to the business. If you're really going to implement continuous monitoring, business should be taking over responsibility. Audit can step back and just assess what the business is doing. It's a good model, but not all business wants to do it. So what we're seeing is this sort of semi-hybrid transition that tends to occur where audit is successfully doing continuous auditing, and then they say, but now what if I just route these exceptions directly to the appropriate business area, business owner, and then let them follow up. They have an escalation procedure where key exceptions are not remediated and not addressed. I've helped support the business to implement continuous monitoring type techniques. I'll observe what happens and follow up what happens with the business when they respond to these exceptions, remediate problem transactions and controls that need to be fixed or improved. So at this point, we've really put a whole series of building blocks in place where you can move through this journey of analytics and particularly move from continuous auditing and then to continuous monitoring. Now, I know there can be debate about continuous monitoring and whether you can go directly there, and we've got customers, we've got users, clients who do that, where the business actually will, independently of audits, say, yeah, we want to monitor transactions in support of some either business performance improvement, some compliance requirements, whatever it may be. But we're still seeing in the vast majority of cases, it's still audit which is driving the business to these techniques. So that's really all I had time to cover. I could get into a whole lot of detail about this and what's involved in every level. What we're actually doing is we're putting together our own materials, sort of methodologies, if you like, that will allow organizations not only to do some form of self-assessment and identify the key building blocks that they need to get to a particular level, but we're also developing our own methodologies that can support the actual implementation processes.